It all begins one stormy night when the King of Scotland fell to his death from his horse in an accident. Had this not have happened, the Baileys would have never risen to power and become the Kings of Scotland themselves, and their cousins, allies, and eventually descendants of William Wallace himself. And so this is how the Baileys rose to power in Scotland and how they shaped the history of Scotland first of all, and then of Ulster.
The night of the 19th of March 1286 was stormy. The Scottish King Alexander III had been carousing at a function in Edinburgh Castle. Late at night, and probably the worse for wear, he ignored his courtiers' advice and insisted on returning home to Kinghorn on the other side of the Firth of Forth. He just married a beautiful French princess half his age. In driving rain and pitch darkness, he set off along the coastal path for his marriage bed. But whether it was a midlife crisis or a noble desire to perform his kingly duties, it was the death of him. Somewhere along the way, his men lost him and his horse stumbled and fell. Later on, he was found here, with his neck broken.
Now, the only surviving member of his family and his legitimate heir was his granddaughter, the Maid of Norway, Margaret, but she died of a fever while crossing the North Sea back to Scotland.
When Alexander's only heir also died, Scotland was thrown into crisis. Powerful rival factions took to arms, and the country slid towards civil war. Without a leader, there was going to be chaos.
A king is going to have to be chosen.
Now, there emerged three main contenders for the throne: John Cummin, or Cummins, Robert the Bruce, who was the grandfather of the more famous Robert the Bruce, and the third was John Bailie, or Bailie.
The story of a king and a rebel. So who was to rule in Scotland now? There were three powerful Scottish noblemen who were good candidates, but only one of them could be king. The Scottish lords weren't sure how or indeed who to choose. After much thought, they decided to ask for help, and so a message was sent to the King of England.
They'd asked the wrong man. Edward I was a ruthless expansionist. He'd already annexed Wales and Ireland. The crisis gave him the chance to bring Scotland into his empire. Under the pretext of preventing civil war, Edward took control of Scotland. At Norham Castle, he made the Scottish nobles acknowledge him as their feudal overlord, the medieval equivalent of mafia dons acknowledging a supreme boss. It meant that when John Balliol was named king, he was Edward's puppet.
So who was this King John the Bailie of Scotland? Now, you can say Bailie because it's always written down as Balliol with an L, and in the documentaries they do pronounce the L, but it was a Norman French name and sometimes they didn't pronounce the L, and that's how it eventually changed from Balliol to Bailie. So, who was this King John of Scotland? And where does our family come into it? Basically, he was a cousin of ours, but I just want to explain who he was and where did he come from. King John of Scotland. So in order to do that, we need to go back to King John's great-grandfather, Hugh. So right, we're starting with Hugh the Bailie. Hugh the Bailie was a great warrior of note. He was Baron of Boywell and had the lordship of Heash in Essex, which was granted to him by King Henry II. Hugh also had lands in Yorkshire, granted him by King John. And Hugh was of that noble warrior class, the Norman barons. It was these same people who only a couple of generations before, one or two generations, had arrived in with William the Conqueror from Normandy in France. In fact, the Baileys accompanied William the Conqueror from France, and when they conquered England, the Baileys were granted territories in the north of England and eventually into Scotland. So, we're in the days now of Hugh. And Hugh would have been as I say, allied and very close to the kings, which would have been the kings of England. Hugh's stronghold was a place called Barnard Castle in Northumberland. And it's noted that Hugh defended his castle against the King of the Scots at that time. Now, Hugh had two important sons, John and Alexander. Now, John's family would go on to be the kings of Scotland, while his brother Alexander's family would eventually fight in support of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. So Hugh has two sons, John and Alexander. We come from Alexander, but let's just talk about John's side, because John is the grandfather of King John of the Scots. So let's start with Hugh's son, John. John was the founder of Balliol College, which is still on the go, and the grandfather of King John the Baillie of Scotland. He was the Sheriff of Cumberland, and he was taken prisoner with King Henry III. He had a son called Alexander, and Alexander had the son John Bailie, King of the Scots. So that's John's side, one of the sons of Hugh. Now, as I said, Hugh the Baillie, he had two important sons. There was John, I just explained, and his other son was Alexander. And that's who our direct family, who we directly descend from, Alexander. Now, Alexander Baillie, he was a baron of a place called Cavers, and he was the great Chamberlain of Scotland. He was our ancestor and the forefather of all who bear the name of Baillie in Scotland and later on of Ulster. Now, I said he was the great Chamberlain of Scotland. That is the Supreme Judge and the Justice General. And he held that position in the reign of his great nephew, King John of Scotland. So if you just think about that for a second, you've got King John the Baillie in Scotland, and his great uncle is Alexander Baillie. He's the great Chamberlain of Scotland. That's who we come from. Now, that Alexander Baillie, the Grand Chamberlain of Scotland, had two sons that I need to explain. His sons were called John and William. Now, I'm going to mention John here because this shows you the origin of our crest, our family shield, which is the 9 stars. So Alexander's Grand Chamberlain of Scotland, his son was John, and he was one of those commissioners when we saw earlier in the documentary when they were trying to decide who was going to be the next King of the Scots, and they came up with the 3 candidates. Well, this John Baillie was one of those barons at that meeting. It was held in Berwick in 1292 with King Edward, or Edward Longshanks of England, when they all met to hear the claims of the competitors for the Scottish crown. John the Baillie fixed his seal to the agreement between Edward I and the Scottish Knights. So that's one of the first mentions of our family crest, the 9 stars of Baillie. Now, the seal at this time only had 6 mullets or stars, but afterwards one of the family who was then living in France killed a wild boar, and he had added another 3 stars, making it 9, to represent a star formation called the Great Bear, or Ursa Major. He took for his crest a boar's head coupe, that means on top of the stars and shield, used in Scottish heraldry, and 2 bars standing proper or upright supporting the shield, with the motto Quid Clarius Astris, which means someone as illustrious as the heavens or the stars. So that's the first mention of our shield, which was used at that time when they were voting on who was going to be the Scottish king, which was his cousin, King John. Now, John's brother, John who used the shield at the thing, John's brother's name was William Baillie, and he's the man that fell in with William Wallace. So that sets the scene for the time that we're in now. You've got King John Baillie, who was elected out of the 3 nobles. You have his great uncle at the time, Alexander Bailie, who would have been older at the time. And Alexander was the Grand Chamberlain of Scotland, that is the Supreme Judge and his Justice General. Then you've Alexander's son, William Bailie, who was an ally and friends with William Wallace. And we come from this William Bailie. So William Bailie and King John Bailie of Scotland were cousins.
King Edward I, whose nickname was Longshanks due to his height and long legs, was known to be a strong, intelligent king, and they hoped he could help them to make the right choice. King Edward looked at the names on the list, a list of possible kings of Scotland. John Comyn, Robert Bruce, John Bale. Which one should he choose? At last he decided upon John Bale. Edward was convinced that not only would John be a good king, but also that he was the most likely to rule Scotland in a way that the English king wanted.
Once Edward I had his hooks into Scotland, he never gave up. In 1296, after repeated humiliations, his puppet king John Balliol rebelled. The Scots assembled an army and raided northern England. It was just the excuse Edward was looking for. He marched north. They say that half the population of Berwick was slaughtered and that the River Tweed ran red as the bodies piled in. The massacre at Berwick was just the beginning. Edward crushed the Scottish army, shut up John Balliol in the Tower of London, and took the Stone of Destiny, the symbol of Scottish kingship, back to Westminster, where it remained for 700 years. It seemed like total capitulation.
As a prisoner of war, John Bale had to be treated with the respect due to a king. And a king would not be kept in a dark, smelly cell or chained to the wall like other prisoners. No, he was kept in the Salt Tower, in rooms fit for a king. And he wasn't there alone. He was allowed to bring servants, in fact, over 20 of them. There were 2 squires, a barber, a chaplain, and his own tailor. He even had his own pack of hunting dogs, and King Edward allowed him to go over 20 miles away to hunt. The distance meant the king granted him yet another privilege. He let him stay out overnight. To do this, King John had to leave a pledgeman behind as security, a member of his household who would be held prisoner if the king didn't come back. But he always did. For the next 3 years, the King of Scotland would be kept in the Tower of London, until at last King Edward agreed he could leave. But he wasn't allowed to go home. Instead, he would go to France to live in exile for the rest of his life.
So that was the end of John the Bailie, the King of the Scots. He was allowed to return to France, but he wasn't never allowed to go back to Scotland again. Just before he was leaving for France, when his baggage was examined at Dover, the royal golden crown and seal of the Kingdom of Scotland and many vessels of gold and silver and a considerable sum of money were found in his chests. Edward I ordered that the crown be offered up to St. Thomas the Martyr, but that the money be returned to John for expenses for his journey. But he kept the seal for himself. John Bailie lived out the rest of his life on his family's ancestral estates at Hellicourt in Picardy. John died in late 1314 at his family's chateau at Hellicourt in France. So effectively now Scotland was left without a monarch until the accession of Robert the Bruce. So now King Edward of England is in charge of Scotland, and there's going to be many rebellions led against him. And one of the more famous leaders of those rebellions was William Wallace. Now we do descend from William Wallace, and I'm going to explain that now in a second. So that's the end of the Bailie Kings, and the rest, he lived out his life in France, and that was that. But don't forget, back in Scotland, he still had his cousin, William Bailie. Now this William back in Scotland, he's our ancestor, and he became friends or allies with William Wallace, and he eventually marries William Wallace's only child, who was a girl. Her name was Marion. So that's the story of what's going on in Scotland at the time. But let's just do a quick family history recap. It all starts off with Hugh the Bailie, who had the stronghold at Barnard Castle. Hugh had the two sons, John and Alexander. John was the founder of Balliol College and was captured with Henry III. He had a son, Alexander, who was the father of King John of the Scots. Now, John's brother, Alexander Bailie, he was the Great Chamberlain, Supreme Judge and Justice General of Scotland in the reign of his great nephew, King John Bailie of Scotland. Alexander had two sons, John of the Seal of the Baileys, and his other son was William Bailie, friend and ally of Wallace. He fights with Wallace and Robert the Bruce in the Scottish Wars of Independence, and he eventually marries Wallace's daughter. So this is William Bailie, cousin of the exiled king, head and ancestor of all the Baileys of Scotland and Ulster after that. We all come from him and William Wallace's daughter, Marion. And I'll explain about how all of that came about in part 2.